shouldn't have happened here, in this austere, raw-boned structure on 2nd Street. Implausible that it occurred in broad daylight at one of the busiest times, with horses, buggies, and street traffic only mere feet from the front door with the number 92 tacked to its column. And yet, it did. 2 people, Andrew and Abby Borden, both in their golden years by that era's reckoning, were mercilessly hacked to death with a hatchet. Abby as she cleaned the upstairs guest room, and Andrew as he lay napping on the sitting room couch downstairs. Not a sound had been heard by the myriad pedestrians outside, but the house, now stained with blood, had witnessed it all. Wow, I wish that I had the capacity to write something like that, but it's actually a quote directly from the Lizzie Borden house website from the history section. I was going to continue with my normal intro, but as soon as I read that, I knew there was no better way to set the scene. So that being said, hello, I'm Anna, and welcome to episode 31 of the Crime Bistro podcast. This show gazes into the thrillingly twisted world of true crime, examining real cases while we share in a passion for crime and coffee alike. For this episode, I have a double espresso, so grab yourself a fresh brew and let's talk about Lizzie Borden. Now, this case is one of the most infamous in U.S. history, not only in New England where it took place, but across the country, and it's well known by both true crime enthusiasts and paranormal believers. There is a lot to unpack here, and the case is technically unsolved, but I'm going to let everyone make their own decisions about that at the end of the episode. One last thing before we start, if you do decide to look into this case further after listening to this episode, the crime scene photos are readily available online, and many of them are uncensored. So if that's something that you don't want to see, please be careful when looking up this case because they are disturbing, to say the least. But for now, let's go ahead and start with Lizzie herself. Lizzie Borden was born on July 19th of 1860 in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is a town of about 94,000 people today, located in Massachusetts, and it abuts the Rhode Island state line. Today, Fall River is known for its cult murders, which we'll have to talk about another time, its Portuguese culture, 1800s textile mills, and Battleship Cove, which is the world's largest collection of World War II naval vessels. I actually did not know that, and I thought it was really interesting. Definitely kind of random, but, you know. Besides that, Fall River today is also quite famous for being the site of this horrific crime. Lizzie Borden was the daughter of Andrew Borden, a successful businessman, and as a child she was described as popular, and she was a very active member of her church. Though she was born in 1860, her mother actually passed away in 1862, and Andrew Borden remarried in 1865 to Abby Borden. So this makes Abby Lizzie's stepmother, and she's also the stepmother to Lizzie's older sister, Emma. Emma is known to have taken on a very maternal role when it came to her younger sister because unfortunately Abby and the girls did not get along very well at all, and most of the disputes that they had were said to be of the financial nature. Lizzie had eventually stopped referring to Abby as mother, calling her instead Mrs. Borden, which I think is very telling, and it's definitely something that we'll keep in mind as we get into the case. Author Cara Robertson, who wrote a very detailed account of Lizzie's trial, has said that Abby is often cast as the evil stepmother type of character, but that in reality she was probably the kindest person who was living in the Borden home. Contrasting the attitudes of his 2 daughters, Andrew Borden was known to be quite frugal, despite the wealth that he had accumulated, and he wasn't exactly well liked in the community, with a reputation for being gruff and parsimonious, which is a pretty respectful way to put that, I think, just based on everything that happens here. The home that the Borden family occupied was only a block away from the center of town, and it has been described as modest even for the standards of the day. Now, look at pictures of this house. I don't think it's modest, but that's maybe just me. I don't know. It seems like a really nice house. Anyway, it had very little indoor plumbing and similarly very little gas lighting. At the time that the Borden murders occurred, Lizzie was 32 years old. On Thursday, August 4th of 1892, 5 people arose for the day in the Borden house at 93 2nd Street. Andrew and Abby, Lizzie, Bridget Sullivan, who was the family housekeeper, and Lizzie's uncle, John Morse, who was visiting from out of town and staying in the guest room. John Morse left in the morning to visit relatives in a different part of town. Andrew Borden left in the morning as well to visit some of the buildings that he owned in the center of town. This left 3 people in the Borden household: Lizzie, Abby, and the maid, Bridget Sullivan. At the time, Emma, who was 41, was away visiting friends, and she hadn't been home for about 2 weeks. So Abby Borden goes upstairs to clean up the guest room after John Morse had spent the night there, and at this time Lizzie claimed that she was in the dining room ironing. Bridget Sullivan was outside washing windows. Andrew returned home at about 10:45 a.m. He greeted his daughter and Bridget and decided to settle down on the couch to take a nap. He fell asleep, apparently peacefully and completely unaware of the horrific death that had befell his wife upstairs, and he remained on the couch asleep as the same killer creeped up and caught him unaware. According to the medical examiner, he was dead just 45 minutes later. Bridget Sullivan, the family housekeeper, was awakened from her own nap to hear Lizzie screaming and calling out to her, saying that someone had come in and killed her father. And within moments, Lizzie was standing at the house's side door, claiming to a neighbor named Adelaide Churchill that she had discovered her father dead, lying on the couch with severe injuries to his head. This is important. Adelaide did not notice any blood on Lizzie's person at all, and police descended very quickly upon the scene. Andrew Borden was discovered just as he had been sleeping, stretched out on the couch in the living room, and he was 70 years old at the time. When investigators arrived, his death had been so recent that his head was still bleeding and his body was warm to the touch. He had no apparent defensive wounds on his body, and it's always been assumed that he was unaware of what had transpired and killed almost instantly. He had been struck 11 times, and his head was essentially crushed. Concern then turned to Abby Borden, as no one knew of her whereabouts at this time. Lizzie and Adelaide, the neighbor, were sitting in the kitchen at this point, and Lizzie remarked that she may have heard her stepmother come in. Bridget Sullivan, the housekeeper, and Adelaide went upstairs and immediately came across a scene that was even worse than the one they'd found downstairs. Abby's body would be discovered upstairs with even more extensive injuries, and an examiner would later determine that she had been dead for about an hour before Andrew was killed, most likely around 9:30 in the morning. Abby was only 36 years old. She was discovered face down with severe injuries to the back of her head. She had been struck 19 times on the back of her head, 18 to the right side and once to the base of her neck. Now let's remember that Lizzie claimed she was downstairs at the time that this happened. Abby Borden was relatively short, but she did weigh about 200 pounds, and if you've ever been in a 19th century home, you'll know that they're not exactly quiet, creaking floorboards and all of that. And yet Lizzie claimed that she heard absolutely nothing. So do we believe her, or I don't know, that one seems a little bit strange to me. But both of the Bordens appeared to have been struck with an axe, which is just so disturbingly brutal, that had a 3.5-inch blade. These crimes were incredibly shocking, not only in their callousness, but in their brutality, so the police, under great pressure to solve these murders, they needed to come up with a theory, and they needed to come up with it quickly. Now, actually, their first assumption was that the perpetrator just must be a deranged stranger, because the scene itself was so appalling. The problem with this theory, however, was that no one had been seen arriving to the home or leaving around this time, so suspicions quickly fell upon the people inside the house. The house was triple locked at the front door and locked at the back door, with the only open entrance being the side door where Lizzie had been standing earlier to give her neighbor Adelaide the news. Because of this, it was very quickly that investigators settled on Lizzie Borden as their obvious prime suspect. On Saturday, August 6th, 2 days after the murders, Abby and Andrew were laid to rest, and news of these horrific murders was spreading quickly. It became front-page news all across the country. Unfortunately, knowledge of forensic science at the time was very primitive, so the crime scene wasn't cordoned off as it would be today. In the days after the murders, the Borden house was crowded with doctors, reporters, concerned neighbors, and even people who were just passing by. For the investigation itself, this meant that nearly all of the evidence collected was contaminated, since there was no way of knowing who had had access to the area. And I know that this was in the 1800s, so we can't be super critical, but still, it's like, really? You just let people walk right on through? Like, it's still a crime scene. You would think that they would have had at least a little bit of foresight, but I digress. The lack of reliable physical evidence aside, however, police knew that they needed to establish a motive for the crime since they had nailed down their timeline at this point. During her inquest, it came out that both Lizzie and Emma Borden resented their father for his frugal nature, and they both thought that they should be living a much more lavish lifestyle. They felt he wasn't providing for them the way that he should have been. On top of this, Andrew had recently bought a house for a half-sibling of Abby's and actually put the house in Abby's name. Lizzie was extremely upset that this house was going to Abby's sister, but to go from upset to cold-blooded murder? Little bit of a jump. We'll talk about it. Something that was immediately confusing to investigators was that besides the areas directly surrounding the bodies of the two murdered Bordens, there was no blood anywhere else in the home, which does bring up a really interesting question. If Lizzie was in fact the killer, how could she have cleaned herself up so quickly? Police searching the house found only 2 places where there was blood evidence, a spot on one of Lizzie's undergarments and a bucket of bloody cloths in the cellar washroom, which immediately is so sketchy. Lizzie did have an explanation for both of these things, saying that she was menstruating, and considering the time, I think honestly this was kind of uncomfortable for investigators and they didn't really look into it any further because of that. At the time, there also wasn't really any method of determining whether it was actually Lizzie's blood anyway, so this ended up being more of a moot point than anything else. This is a piece of the case that gets brought up a lot, and I do find it to be really suspicious. This one is really the part of the case that gets me, where I'm like, oh, that's really sketchy. Lizzie burned one of her dresses in the kitchen stove on the Sunday immediately following the funerals, which would have been August 7th. That's not exactly innocent person behavior, but she does have an explanation for it, as sketchy as the explanation is as well. In response to this, Lizzie and Bridget, who was present for the burning of the dress, claimed that the dress had been stained by paint and that there was no repairing it, so it needed to be burned. As far as excuses go, that's pretty bad, but I'm trying to give everybody in this the benefit of the doubt, because again, this is an unsolved case. We don't know who did it. Not knowing what the truth is about the dress, it is assumed that this was the dress Lizzie was wearing when she killed her father and Abby, and that she burned it because it was covered in their blood. That's what most people think. If she had committed the murders in this dress and immediately changed into a clean one, now that the bloody dress was gone, there would be nothing to explain. Again, I'm saying if, since no one really knows the truth about what happened that day. So without much to go on, the police just had to keep looking. In the basement of the Borden house, they would discover a hatchet head in a box of abandoned tools, which is now referred to as the handleless hatchet. Only a small piece of the wooden handle actually remained, and police believed that the break had been recent. The blade itself was about 3.5 inches long, which was consistent with the injuries to both Andrew and Abby Borden. The blade also appeared to be covered in a layer of ash, and it is speculated that Lizzie did this on purpose to hide any evidence on it, and also to just make it look like another random piece of junk that was thrown into the basement. On the subject of murder weapons, police did find another piece of circumstantial evidence, as someone who identified themselves as Lizzie Borden had attempted to buy prussic acid the day before the murders, which was August 3rd. Prussic acid is a lethal poison, and in 1892 it was only available with a doctor's prescription. Whoever this person was, whether it actually was Lizzie or not, said that they needed the acid to put an edge on a sealskin cape, which is something that Lizzie had owned. I don't even want to know. The pharmacist who she approached said that he had never heard of this usage for prussic acid, so he refused to sell it to her. Probably a good thing. If this encounter really occurred, Lizzie would then have returned to her best option, a readily available weapon that was already within the home. Seemingly convinced, by the time Lizzie's inquest was over, the chief of police placed her under arrest for the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The headline, quote, "It is done. Lizzie Borden has been arrested," end quote. So let's talk about the trial of Lizzie Borden. This started on June 5th of 1893, which was 10 months after Lizzie was arrested, and it took place in the Superior Court in New Bedford, Massachusetts. This trial was beyond bizarre for this time period, and many people consider it to be a predecessor to contemporary legal trials that have captivated the public. So think about cases like Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, or the Casey Anthony trial. There is another angle to this case, however, and it isn't something that I honestly gave a lot of thought to before researching, but Lizzie became very quickly what would have been a minor celebrity today, and for the time, dedicating so much press and attention to a woman, no less for a crime as brutal as this one, was definitely out of the ordinary. There are countless articles, courtroom sketches, photos, and more from this case that are well documented and still accessible to this day. This, I think, can tell us a lot about the attitude surrounding this crime, and I think that it really demonstrates how shocked people were by the fact that somebody was callous enough to commit these murders, again, in broad daylight. But anyways, let's get back to the case. The first day of Lizzie's trial brought in a huge crowd of spectators, including reporters from all over the country, and at the time it was called the trial of the century, so think O.J. Simpson, but in the 1800s. Interestingly, many of the spectators were women, and women of the time seemed to have a particular fascination with Lizzie and what she had been accused of. Despite this, women were not allowed to serve on juries at the time, so Lizzie was facing a judgment from a 12-man jury and a panel of 3 judges. Side note, there were actually no women jurors in Massachusetts until 1951, which I had no idea, and that really kind of blew my mind. That's very recent, honestly. In opening statements, the prosecutor alleged that Lizzie was the only person who had both the opportunity and the motive to commit both murders. There is a famous courtroom sketch of this moment at the end of his opening statement, but essentially the prosecutor alludes to his having the skulls of both victims present with him in the courtroom, and at this, Lizzie fainted. Now, I think this is the important part with this little tidbit about the case, but a lot of people allude to her fainting as kind of her being like, oh no, I'm caught. I do think that if you were in court and somebody said that they had your father's and your stepmother's skulls with them, you would probably faint too, so I don't really put too much stock into that one. The prosecution would lay out all of their evidence over the next week of proceedings, including this point about the estate and inheritance money. If Andrew had been killed first, then Abby's family would receive some compensation from Andrew's estate. However, if Abby was killed first, which we know is what happened, then Lizzie and Emma would be the sole beneficiaries. Now this is disturbing, so I can only imagine what the reaction must have been for those who were actually in the courtroom, but the supposed murder weapon was matched up against the skulls, so we did have them, of the 2 victims to show that the dimensions matched. The prosecution also brought in some medical experts who testified that a woman of Lizzie's build was capable of committing these murders, and it is important to mention that there were certain pieces of evidence that were not allowed to be presented in the courtroom, and most controversially, Lizzie's alleged attempt to buy prussic acid was not allowed to be presented to the jury. The attempt to buy prussic acid was seen as far too prejudicial for the jury to hear, which I do kind of agree with, considering, 1800s, you didn't have any CCTV footage. It's not like you could really prove that it was her, but it's interesting. The prosecution presented their case over the course of 9 days in the courtroom before they rested, and then it was time for the defense to present their side. And the basis of their argument was pretty much to be expected, that Lizzie was an innocent person who had just been caught up in a horrific situation. The defense relied on the lack of physical evidence to make their case, and in total they had only 2 days' worth of testimony. According to experts on this case, the most important testimony for Lizzie's defense was her sister, Emma. She testified that it was her idea to burn the dress, which was able to cast enough reasonable doubt and make it seem like a relatively innocent coincidence, if there ever can be such a thing. Lizzie herself never took the stand in her defense, which honestly was probably smart, and closing arguments started just 3 weeks into the trial. The only thing that Lizzie is known to have said in the courtroom was right before the jury went to deliberate, quote, "I am innocent. I leave it to my counsel to speak for me," end quote. Once they went into deliberation, the jury took less than 2 hours, which is unheard of, to make their final verdict, which is crazy in cases where a violent crime like this took place. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the foreman, nearly unable to contain his excitement, just blurted out their decision, not guilty. With this announcement, Lizzie collapsed into her chair and shifted herself forward to rest her head on the railing in front of her. The people in the courtroom cheered, and the people who had been waiting outside of the courtroom cheered as well. There is a lot of speculation surrounding this verdict, and in particular people who believe that this case should only be viewed through the lens of a juror in the 1800s. It's unfortunate to consider, but the jury's decision has been seen as an articulation of what was normal behavior for a woman of Lizzie's age, social status, and race. Basically, the thought is that they acquitted Lizzie because they didn't believe that someone like her would commit a crime like this. Even with those prejudices aside, there were a lot of holes in this case. There was no witness, no solid physical evidence, a very, very contaminated crime scene, potential evidence that had been destroyed, and the inability to test the blood that was found in the Borden house. Lizzie definitely had the means and motive, but that doesn't always mean that there's no room for reasonable doubt in making a case in court. Many have also argued that logistically it would have been impossible for Lizzie to commit the murders and clean up afterwards in a reasonable amount of time. But of course, this brings up an interesting question. If Lizzie didn't commit the murders, then who did? There have been many theories that have come up throughout the years, as interest in this case has never really waned, and some of them, I'll admit, are pretty compelling. If you remember, there was someone else in the house the night before the murders and the morning of, and this was Uncle John Morse. He was familiar with the home and familiar with the family. However, there are many witnesses who reported him being away from the home at the times that the murders occurred, and there isn't really a clear motive here. John Morse himself is a pretty elusive character, and pretty much all that's known about him is a collection of just random facts. At various points, he had lived in Massachusetts, Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa. John Morse was one of the witnesses who was called during the inquest and the trial, and he was briefly a suspect himself. He was known to be a farmer and a horse trader. But beyond that, here's what we know about him. He was born in Fall River on July 5th of 1833, and he was the seventh child born to Anthony Morse and Rhonda Morrison. Sarah Anthony Morse, John's older sister, married Andrew Borden on December 25th of 1845 in Fall River, and Sarah Anthony had passed away in Fall River by the year 1870. John Morse did have relatives in the area around Fall River at the time of the murders, and his alibi was that he was visiting a niece and nephew, his brother's children. However, it has been rumored that Morse and Andrew had argued before the murders and that there were tensions between the two that were related to a livestock venture. When John Morse was questioned by police, he did change his timeline a couple of times, claiming to have returned to the Borden house first at noon, then at 11:30, and then at 11:20, but some people have speculated that he was lying and actually returned way earlier. John Morse passed away on March 1st of 1912 of heart troubles, according to the Mills County Tribune. This one is an interesting theory, and I don't think that it's impossible at all. Actually, it is one of the more plausible alternatives in this case to me, but I'm not completely convinced of its legitimacy either. The next theory that I want to talk about is the wild-eyed man theory. I know that sounds crazy, just bear with me here. Lizzie told police that she had seen a wild-eyed man lurking around the Borden house on that Thursday morning, and several Fall River residents would also report seeing a man who matched the description that Lizzie gave near the house. But once this theory was investigated further, some secrets contained within the family started to reveal themselves in a really fascinating way. Suppose this wild-eyed man was actually someone who was known to the family. An author named Arnold Brown wrote a book on this case titled Lizzie Borden, The Legend, the Truth, the Final Chapter. In this book, he claims that the man outside the Borden home was Andrew's illegitimate son, William Borden. Lizzie and Emma had already been unsettled about possible changes to the family finances and to their own estates, so Arnold Brown has theorized that Lizzie contacted William to help persuade Andrew to keep his money within the family. While waiting for Andrew to return from the errands that morning, something must have clicked in William's head, causing him to fly into an angry flurry and kill Abby. The explanation given for this is that William had a particular hatred for Abby for taking the place of his own mother as Andrew's wife, and that he was not of sound mind at the time. Once Andrew got home, the theory continues with an argument between the two of them and a dismissal from Andrew himself before he laid down on the couch for a nap, at which point William killed his father as well. This is a lot, but honestly I'm not at all convinced, and obviously people can have their own opinions, but this is quite a story, and my issue with it is that the story was told in such a way that covers almost every point almost too perfectly. There were witnesses that saw this apparent strange man outside of the Borden house, but to me the rest of this seems like a really big stretch. Not to mention, in order for this to be true, Lizzie would have gone to trial knowing that she could be convicted for something that she didn't do. So if this theory were true, Lizzie and Emma would have remained the sole heirs to Andrew's money only if she was acquitted, and this seems like a huge risk. If the point of all of this really was money, then why would Lizzie put herself in a position to lose everything? Again, I'm not convinced on this one, it just seems a little bit too out there. And I also think that it's pertinent to mention that I've seen some of the quotes from this book, and Arnold Brown presents a pretty intense assault on Andrew Borden's character, so I'm not sure that his theories aren't biased. Again, this is just my opinion, but that's what I think. The next theory in this case, and one of the more famous ones, is that Lizzie and Bridget, the housekeeper, committed this crime together. This theory postulates that Lizzie and Bridget were having an affair, and that it's possible Abby had discovered the affair and had threatened to tell Andrew. Thus, Abby was killed by Lizzie and Bridget so that she couldn't reveal their secret. Now, I will say this one is actually really interesting to me because I do think that if Lizzie was really the perpetrator of these murders, it would almost be impossible for Bridget not to have heard anything. So if she was present in the house, it seems to make sense that Bridget would have had to have been involved in some way, especially because she was there for the burning of that dress that we talked about. But that's my thought on this case in general. I think if Lizzie committed the crimes, it's hard to imagine a scenario where Bridget was unaware of it. But there's also a couple reasons that this isn't the most likely scenario, so let's talk about that too. First and foremost, right off the bat, there is literally no evidence that Lizzie and Bridget were in a relationship, and it's not like this would have been easy to hide in a house that was described as cramped and full of family members all the time. Not to mention, if Abby had discovered the affair, it would be a plausible reason for Lizzie to kill her stepmother, but not at all a reason to kill her father. So that really kind of casts some doubt on the theory for me because it takes away from the motive a little bit. The next theory is that Bridget herself committed the two murders, and I kind of take issue with this one for the same exact reason. If Bridget were guilty, I think Lizzie would have had to have helped her cover up the crime in some way, since neither one of them had blood on themselves or on their clothes. It has been speculated that due to mistreatment from the Borden family, Bridget snapped and murdered Andrew and Abby, but she's reported to have had a reasonably respectful working relationship with them. Also, if she was really that unhappy working for the family, there would have been nothing stopping her from just quitting. And she actually did quit shortly after the murders occurred. She quit working for the two surviving sisters, so for me, this is just kind of a no-go. The next theory that I want to talk about in regard to this case is that Lizzie and Emma conspired together to kill Andrew and Abby. The thing about this theory that really interests me is that Emma was such a key witness for Lizzie's defense, but again, I'm not totally convinced on this one. Obviously, there was a lot of tension among the family members, most of which was financial, and after Andrew had bought that house for Abby's half-sister, it's speculated that his daughters were concerned about how much money he was actually giving to relatives of Abby and how much would be left for them. It's also speculated that Andrew was physically abusive to the two daughters, but I'm only mentioning this to say that there is absolutely no evidence of any abuse, and Andrew obviously is not here to defend himself, so I don't think anyone should be stuck on that point. Honestly, I do think that this is plausible, but it's really speculative, and I wouldn't bet anything on it, especially not knowing enough about Emma to say whether this is something she could even be capable of. But that's kind of it on the theories for this case, so I want to just touch on kind of the overall picture here. I think it's really interesting that all of the theories involve either one or two family members, and it seems like it would have had to have been somebody who was either in the house, had access to the house, knew the family very well, something along those lines, because either Abby and Andrew were snuck up on, or they didn't scream out, or they didn't defend themselves because they were approached by somebody who they knew. That seems to make sense to me. I think it's some combination of the family members who committed this crime, but I just don't know which family members, who was involved, who knew what, and I can't seem to figure it out, and I don't think that we'll ever know, but it is really fascinating to go through and speculate about all of the different people who were in and around the house at the time. So after the trial, Lizzie resumed her life as it had been, and she stayed in Fall River. Emma and Lizzie did inherit almost $350,000 from her father, which today equates to about $10 million, and used part of their inheritance to buy a house that was much larger and in a wealthier part of town. She changed her name from Lizzie to Lizbeth, and the sisters named their new home Maplecroft. Now, people did raise some eyebrows when it came to this behavior, and many people saw it as distasteful to spend so much of their father's money so quickly after his death. The members of Lizzie's church did offer her some support during the trial, but afterwards she found that she was no longer welcome there. What is interesting is that 12 years after the trial concluded, Emma, who had been living with Lizzie, was seemingly deeply unsettled by something in their relationship and decided to cut all ties to her sister. Lizzie never married, and she spent many of her later years as a recluse in her impressively massive but mostly empty home with no companion other than her dogs. She would pass away in June of 1927, and she never once, at least publicly, shared her side of the story. Emma had moved to New Hampshire, and she actually died only 9 days after Lizzie did. The two were buried next to one another alongside Andrew and Abby, with Lizzie's gravestone naming her as Lizbeth. Today, the Lizzie Borden house is a fully functional hotel and tourist destination, and in addition to offering tours, you can actually stay there. They offer a lot of different options for your stay, but you can either rent out a single room or the entire house. For both, you'll get access to extended house tours, and I realize this is starting to sound like an ad, and I promise it's not. I really just wanted to share this next thing. If you rent out the house for exclusive use, you'll get the option to add a Lily doll or an official Lizzie Borden axe of your choice, which is taking morbid to like a whole new level. They also offer a romance package. Like, are we kidding? Because nothing about this house feels like a romantic getaway, even to me. Like, I'm interested in this stuff, and oh my god, that's disturbing. You can choose any combination of souvenirs to be placed in each room in advance, and I'm sorry, but souvenirs? Not only does that feel really icky, but it's kind of tone deaf. I don't know, I feel like if I were Abby Borden, I would not be thrilled about all of this. I don't know, I just found those things to be a little bit bizarre, so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned them before ending off this episode here. True crime can be really fascinating, and I think that it's completely natural to have a little bit of morbid curiosity, but souvenirs might just be taking it a little bit too far. The house has been restored to how it appeared on the day of the murders and is complete with actual crime scene photos and replicas of the skulls of Andrew and Abby. Now, going over the theories in this case is really tough, as I mentioned, because this happened so long ago, and it was such a sensationalized case. The reporting on the different characters here is kind of sketchy. I gathered the information that was available, but since it's been unsolved for so long, a lot of it is speculation, so I want to mention that too. I also want to be careful of attacking Andrew Borden's character, since reports have varied from saying that he was a completely normal businessman to claiming that he was this horrible person, and the truth about him seems to have gotten lost over the years. So that begs the question, what do I actually think? I don't know. But the lack of evidence and the abundance of theories in this case does really muddy the waters. So here's what I'm going to say about it. I don't think that a guilty verdict would have been warranted for Lizzie based on the lack of evidence that was presented at her trial. I also think that the perception of women at the time was a major factor in her acquittal, which does complicate some things. That being said, I don't think that any of that means she didn't do this, but there are almost equal arguments for Lizzie, Emma, Bridget, and John Morse in this case. Because these murders happened literally in broad daylight, the random stranger theory doesn't do that much for me. So I will say that I don't know who committed the murders, but I'm definitely not leaning towards Lizzie more than anyone else after doing all of the research for this case. But I am super interested to see what everyone else's opinions are on this case. Do we think that Lizzie actually deserves the infamy that this case gave to her? But this, for now, is the story of the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Crime Bistro podcast, and if you have any thoughts to share on this case, I would love to hear some other opinions, because I honestly feel like I have more questions than I did before I started researching. But that being said, this episode is coming to a close, so thank you again for listening, and as always, until next time.